Well, hello everyone. My name is Krian Butler and I'm the Director of the Global Economy and Finance Program in Chatham House. And it's my really great pleasure to welcome you all to today's conference on green accountability and climate finance. Now this is a tremendously important issue. We all know that we face an enormous challenge in raising the climate finance needed to achieve net zero and to protect vulnerable countries from the baked-in effects of climate change. And there are various estimates around, but one estimate, for example, is that some $2.4 trillion a year will be needed for emerging economies, developing economies, excluding China by 2030. So these are enormous amounts. But if we cannot ensure that there is effective transparency, accountability, and participation in these climate finance flows, we could easily find that a large share of both the public and the private funds that are raised are wasted. And this is either because they don't do the things that they need to do in terms of mitigation and adaptation, or because they're just simply lost due to weak governance and corruption. And this would be a disaster. I mean, it would be an existential disaster if we were actually able to raise the funds, but then actually not apply them effectively. Now, this is exactly the right time to be talking about this issue in the run-up to next week's summit on a new financing pact, and with a new president taking over at the World Bank. And my sense is that this issue isn't yet actually in all the enormous kind of debate and discussion that's taking place. Moreover, the solutions are not easy, partly because in normal circumstances, strengthening accountability and transparency is a very complex process and takes a lot of time. But also in today's climate context, there is an imperative to ensure that these climate finance funds flow quickly. So we need to ensure they have impact, but we also need to ensure that they flow quickly. So I'd like to make just 4 further points before handing over to Ali. Firstly, to note that today's conference, our intention is that it should be as interactive as possible, and that we should end up with practical recommendations on how to take this agenda forward. And we've structured the day with that in mind. Secondly, I want to thank Louise and Ali and the team at the World Bank and the Global Partnership for Social Accountability for their very generous support, and indeed for coming to us with the idea of having this event. So we're enormously grateful for them for doing that. Third, to note that while this conference will be primarily under the Chatham House rule, and the Chatham House rule means that you can use the ideas you hear, but you cannot say where you heard them or from whom you heard them. The keynote remarks, the 2 keynote remark sessions, will be publicly available, both live stream now and available in video form subsequently. And fourth and finally, because I haven't yet had the chance to do this, to all those who are moderating sessions, pleased to ask you to keep your sessions very much to time, both to make the live streaming work possible, but also to preserve as much of the time for networking and discussion as we can. So with that, Ali, over to you.
Great. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And Krian, from our rather fortuitous introduction to this point, I think it's been great to work with Chatham House and sort of bring together like-minded people on this agenda. So we're flying here obviously from Washington, and as you probably saw in the news, the smoke descended on the East Coast of the United States this week. And I think it was interesting as you went about town hearing from people that this is climate change. And I think it takes moments in time, and I think it takes moments in time, like Krian said, when we're reimagining the future architecture that's going to drive the change we need to see in the world, but it's also moments in time in the very reality around us. And there was some writing sort of reflecting back to the London fog, and what we forget is that the London fog is not about the natural nature of London. It was what we were putting into the air. It was, lack of control, people not having a voice to address issues in the air that were affecting their health, killing them. And it's people, right? And that's what we're here to talk about today, is that we can get to the trillions, we hope, But the discussion just can't be about quantity. It has to also be about quality. And quality, in the end, is a people-driven approach. And for those of us who think about these things, it's quite striking to us that in these international climate discussions today, the role of people is quite tangential. It's a footnote. It's a nice to have. It's about engaging the stakeholders rather than building the systems we need to bring people into climate finance decisions. And that's what green accountability is about. Green accountability is a term we've coined to sort of bring people together around this theme of transparent and inclusive decision-making for climate finance planning, allocation, and oversight. It means that we can't get to net zero without transparency, participation, accountability as a concrete set of principles, organizing values, and systems that require resourcing. We need mechanisms we can deploy in how we make climate finance decisions globally, but all the way down to the community and village level. This affects renewables, this affects adaptation, this affects the massive reforestation we need to achieve. But people-centered systems right now are not being thought of as an integral part of climate finance delivery. And at the end, all of us know that this is a collective action problem. And collective action problems are never solved in human history without the organization of people, institutions, and systems. So that's what we want to drive the conversation here today, to talk about what are the government governance mechanisms we need to set up on government side and on the demand side with people to ensure that upfront decisions, information, and local knowledge are coming into climate finance decision making at global levels, at regional levels, at national levels. What are open, transparent, real-time, comprehensive data transparency channels we can build? There is a technology dimension here. There's a dimension of bringing information to people that they can use, that they can act on, that they can advocate on. There are channels that need to be built between civil society and citizens to have an enhanced role for advocacy, monitoring, and reporting. The Global Partnership for Social Accountability launched our Green Accountability Initiative some months ago to start showcasing what it means when you bring civil society in to build global level learning and national level systems collaboratively with government. We'll announce soon the consortium of global and southern CSOs who will become the on-granting facility for this new platform. But this is a drop in the bucket. We need to invest in this kind of work. And so that brings me to the role a lot of us have to play. There's a role for the providers of climate finance, institutions like the World Bank. There's a role for client countries that are going to receive the massive amounts of public climate finance and increasingly blend it with private finance flow. There's a critical role for local intermediaries and civil society. And there's a role for the private sector. And we have to discuss all these roles today. We've been collaborating with Systemic, and we have some very interesting numbers to bring forward today, preliminary analysis, because we have to put a quantitative dimension to what we're talking about. This isn't just about a normative thing, because it is the right thing to do, but this is about quality, impact, and efficiency of resources that need to be spent to the dollar. Our preliminary analysis, and Catherine Sadulka is our collaborator at Systemic. We'll be discussing this more today. But we are finding from our initial modeling that meaningfully integrating green accountability could save more than $100 billion a year out of the roughly $320 billion a year in public climate finance, and help avoid 3 gigatons of annual GHG emissions. This will relate to effective deployment of capital and bringing critical local knowledge and participation that's currently not being integrated. Allocating just 5 to 10% of funds to ensure programs are designed and deployed with green accountability would greatly improve the productivity of climate finance. Better and quality matters as much, if not more, than quantity. We have to start having this discussion. In short, we like to think green accountability is a no-brainer, so it puzzles us why this is not part of our global financial architecture discussions. We need to equip institutions like our own and others and bring them together with people, citizens, and civil societies to build the future architecture for our livable and just planet. Thank you.
So at that point, we hand over to Louise for the next session.
And now I just have to, it just locked on me. Good morning, and really what a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much to Chatham House, to Crehan, to hosting us and all of you for being here. For this discussion, I think Ali framed it incredibly well, that we don't understand why it's not front and center in everybody's mind when we're discussing climate action today. I don't think I need to tell this group that we're facing a polycrisis. We were just talking about it in having coffee. Issues of climate, conflict, growing inequality, exclusion, poverty, recurrent pandemics. And as Ali mentioned, to address these challenges, we need collective action. It's unlike any development challenge we've faced before, which one country can take or another country can assist. This is something that affects countries need to act collectively, and as an international community, we need to act as a collective across the North and across the global South. These issues are also intertwined, making it all the more difficult to address one without addressing the other for us. This is unlike any global challenge I think we've faced since Chatham House was established, since World War II. I don't think we've faced a challenge that has affected the world's existential existence to the extent we're doing it now. Progress in all these areas has been slow or even backtracking, as we know. And time is running out, especially if we do want to keep to a 1.5 degree standard. And the question for us is how to tackle these, how to tackle them simultaneously, and particularly how to tackle climate, which is the one that seems the most overwhelming and the most pressing. And I would argue that what we've been doing so far is not enough. The approach that we've taken so far is, well, let's grow, let's tax, let's redistribute, let's make markets work more efficiently, and everything's going to work out. We'll invest in human capital, and people will find employment, and problems will be resolved. More recently, to the economic dimension, we've added some focus on environmental sustainability. But are we implementing it? Are we able to carry it forward? And there's been the challenge. If we want to act on environmental sustainability and we want to promote inclusive growth and really put those policies into place that would lead to more inclusive growth, those market reforms, reducing the subsidies on carbon and other forms of high agricultural subsidies, fertilizers, and so forth, we need to put into place, I would argue, social sustainability as well. That triad needs to be environment, economic, and social sustainability, which puts an emphasis on the collective. We define at the bank social sustainability is when people feel part of the development process and believe that they and their descendants will benefit from it. This means that societies and communities are able to come together to tackle collective challenges such as drought, flooding, or bad air quality in a way that all people thrive over time and that is perceived to be fair and just. For us, this unpacks itself into four key dimensions. Thriving over time is inclusive and resilient because of the time. Inclusive, that everyone has access to markets and services and the opportunity to live a life with dignity. Over time, and resilience, that you're safe, you're able to mitigate or avoid risk, and you're free from child labor, human trafficking, gender-based violence, because you cannot thrive over time otherwise. But being able to come together collectively requires trust. That collective action, we know, we've seen communities with greater trust are better placed to tackle COVID and implement COVID restrictions. In the Middle East and North Africa, they're better placed to improve educational quality in their communities. And in Aceh, after the tidal wave, they were better able to respond and to recover more quickly. And trust is something that we've seen in the recent years decline. It's been on a dramatic decline globally since 2004, since I've seen some of the measurements. And finally, this idea of process legitimacy, which means that you're taking decisions that people find to be fair and just. We believe that climate policy has to be based on social sustainability, has to integrate those principles if we are to put people at the center, and if we are to be able to take the tough decisions that we need to make to advance on climate challenges. There has been progress. Maybe it's not as central as we would like to see the social dimension, the people dimension, the transparency dimension in climate policy. But there have been good examples that we can build on. But it's, I have to say, fragmented and somewhat ad hoc. We can cite the SCASGU agreement in Latin America, which promotes transparent access to information and collective decision-making around environmental resources, similar to the Aarhus Agreement in Europe. We can talk about growing emphasis on ESG and ensuring that there's social in the environmental and sustainable good governance, and that this involves stakeholder engagement, grievance redress mechanisms, fair labor standards, child labor standards, safety and access and decision-making engagement over land use, which is so critical in the climate debate as we try to build solar farms, and there's more mining on lands that belong to indigenous peoples. All this is happening under ESG, but too slowly, not sufficiently, and lack of clarity and agreement across all parties in public and private sector. But we're also seeing change. We also have a framework, if you will. Perhaps we definitely need to take it further, but in the Paris Agreement in Article 13, which does call for transparency in decision-making. And then finally, the Global Partnership for Social Accountability, which, as Ali mentioned, has just launched a call for green accountability to work with civil society to promote better access to information, collective decision-making, and transparency around climate policy. We need to do much more, though, if we are to really achieve the 1.5 goal and really make sure that it becomes a reality. We need to make this much more central to climate policy and to climate action. We need to have decision-making, as Ali said, that is participatory, that is transparent, that is inclusive, that all who are impacted are involved in the policy arena around climate. That's what we're here to discuss today, and it's very exciting that we've come together around this agenda, as you say, at this moment in time when so much is at play and so much is happening. And we have so many events coming up, you know, the COP, the World Bank annual meetings, the SDGs, the Macron Summit. There's a lot coming up where we can work collectively, those in the room and outside, to put this agenda at the center, because it is the missing part to having climate action. History 30 years from now will hold us accountable, coming to how well we know we're going to spend the money. We know we're going to get the money to address climate change. In many cases, it's already out there. But will we use this money wisely? Will we use it to reduce poverty? Or will we see 30 years from now, yes, we've addressed climate more or less, but the gaps in wealth remain or have increased, and persistent poverty is still out there. We have a choice now. We will be spending trillions. How we use that money to promote poverty reduction, inclusion, and accountable development is really something that we can influence today, and it's the core of our discussion. So I don't want to take up any more time. I'm really excited to introduce our other speakers in this session. It is my pleasure to introduce Senator Sherry Rehman, who's the Federal Minister for Climate Change in the government of Pakistan, and a true advocate and leader in the Global South, demanding action and rapid action and inclusive action on this agenda. We will also be hearing from Rémi Rieu, who is the CEO of the French Agency for Development, Agence Française de Développement, and it's a real pleasure to hear from Rémi. AFD is one of our partners in our green accountability effort and launch, and it's really great, and a leader. I should say AFD has been a leader, and France has obviously been a leader in the climate discussions. So really excited to hear from Rémi. Let us start with Senator Sherry Rehman, our Honorable Minister, who I believe can only join us for her presentation and will not be able to stay for discussion. Over to you, Minister.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you, Chatham House, for organizing this and this important convening at a time when climate financing is about to become a buzzword, as are so many other things. And we have begun to normalize a lot of climate crisis as par for the course, as stuff for conferences where we make declarations and then we move on to what we think are more current and important issues. So climate is always, at the end of the day, it's a big talking point, which I will try to address, but also becomes, a footnote when governments are planning as well as other entities. But some of that is changing, and I really appreciate your focus on climate finance. Um, for so I'd like to say thank you once again, and begin this for as quickly as possible, because Pakistan is bracing for a cyclone that's coming our way. It's called Cyclone Biparjoy, and it's gaining intensity towards our coastline areas, which are still struggling to rebuild from a massive flood in 2022. So while I'm not the disaster management entity, it is my job to be creating, coordinating units for this and responses. So I hope you'll bear with me then. Um, I think, we've been talking about this at international convenings. There's a lot going on in the world, and we're, gearing up for the France conference. But the world is in profound transition, and we have to acknowledge that there's a growing competition for resources. And in that, climate financing itself is at a changing intersect of, we hope, what I call big ticket reassessments. And in those reassessments, I hope that a great deal of what we said, or the speaker earlier addressed in terms of inclusion, in terms of understanding the scale and map of vulnerability the world right now faces in its accelerated impacts of in the accelerated impacts of climate change, need transformational thinking. So the coming into climate finance, just diving right in, look, it's an entirely fragmented value chain right now, the whole climate financing chain. It does need the transformational thinking I'm talking about, both in terms of quantum needed for any real and social and inclusive impact, but also to bridge the dangerous gap between different levels of emitters, especially for the less prepared developing world, where the speed and scale of financing can mean the difference now between survival and subsistence, development or dystopia. Now, I say this with the full backing of a landscape of human tragedy that unfolds every time now that a climate-related summer upends all development goals, upends all planning, and creates a complete climate of, disrepair in terms of building resilience. How do you build resilience in such a climate where you're already all the time struggling to rebuild from the last disaster? So many countries are in that resilience trap. And currently, climate financing is certainly is a big talking point at big convenings. It attracts affiliated investments, especially if we tag on climate change to the conversation or the bid, I've noticed. But while playing a pivotal role in supporting global efforts to combat climate change and build a sustainable future, my question is, how available is it to those who need it the most, within countries as well as countries that now face constant barriers to obtaining climate financing with the agility and speed and scale we need? So as it stands, the capitalization of public financing, just for context, is at a fraction of global pledges made, because this is what we deal in, global pledges. The UN estimates that developing countries already need $70 billion per year to cover adaptation costs, and will need $140 to $300 billion in 2030, just until 2030, which will then rise to 280 to 500 billion by 2050. I think these numbers are grossly underestimated, because just the World Bank, which I believe is also associated with this conference, has estimated in its country and climate report for Pakistan that $348 billion will be needed until 2030 to literally keep our head above water. Now, that's the flood waters, which still inundate the country, but also the crises of public debt and financing. So total coming back to UN numbers, even in that framework, total annual investments required by developing countries would hit about $2.4 trillion by 2030, and by 2050, 2050, the economic cost of climate change will be between $1 trillion and $1.8 trillion. I think these figures will keep going up because no such amount or transfer is available to countries trying to access climate funds, let alone humanitarian disaster financing, which is usually only front-loaded by the UN and by bilateral partners, and remains typically underfinanced now by 40%. As you know, the creation of a loss and damage fund at COP27 was seen as a big win for an axis of collaboration, a successful one between civil society actors and the developing countries. We reached some level of critical mass and were able to leverage it for leadership. But so far, again, almost a year from now, we're running up to COP28. So far, it remains in a bit of structural limbo. While adaptation financing itself, which is important for those of us in the global south, literally finds itself on the Cinderella slot of both conferencing or financing agendas at the big convenience. Mitigation, for instance, got 90% of green financing, with developed countries getting the lion's share between just 2019 and 2020. So that's 1 year of the climate green financing we're talking about. Separate from green financing, from climate financing we're talking about, but I'm talking about the formal channels that countries are expected to access with the tag of climate financing. Here, the formal green financing mechanisms themselves, usually rooted by the GCF and GEF, are difficult to access because they require projectization, which then goes into onerous competitive bidding processes. And once, if you do win the bids, which we do tend to, they take as long as 18 months to materialize. By then, the facts on the ground have changed, our talking points have changed, the scale of human suffering, as I mentioned, has totally changed because climate change is coming on so fast, it can't even be called change anymore, it's an emergency. It's coming on so fast and furious that we're having trouble just understanding its scale and velocity. So basically, other than pitch for carbon credits on market frameworks that are non-standardized and fragmented with no clear frameworks, and every country has to make its own, and taxation is being advocated, it doesn't really become a viable option because it adds to energy prices, which are under stress in any case, and that burdens the growing mass of those who are at the bottom of the social pyramid. So green financing, for its own part, has become a site of growing contests of all sorts, right? Big business remains outside the formal conference of party convenings, and I bring this up because, frankly, the ESG kind of pipelines are no longer enough for the quantum of profits that many businesses, big businesses, create, and the emissions also that they're responsible for. So they remain untapped as a resource for any real change that tips the scales. Now, here's the thing: I don't think that contests or competition at this point is particularly helpful. But what can be done is to bring the private sector, other than talk of blended financing. We'll talk about that later, but it's really blended financing, and private financing has not shown itself as a big, has not rushed to the headlines or front lines of the developing world because it requires a fair amount of risk insurance, and risk insurance is another subject that I'm sure you'll be addressing, and that is non-available in a terrain that is changing so fast that neither its agriculture or livelihood resources remain stable or in the context of predictability needed for the kind of private investments required. What private investors. So I really think that instead of bringing more aggression to the big convening tables, the public sector financing is clearly drying up. What is needed is big business needs to not be running its side shows, very dazzling side shows at the big COP convenings. They need to, and I'm sure they'll want to, be part of the solution, and not as a sideshow, but as a party that can tip the scales to transformational change and bring in the level of climate financing just as percentages, which national taxation regimes cannot. So I know it's not something that people want to hear, especially at the UNFCCC, because naturally they deal, for them, the definition of parties is countries and states, and that will remain the case. But there has to be some creative way of bringing in the big emitters and the big spenders and the big profit makers into this room, because while they remain outside the room, we keep talking about countries. Now, countries are neither emitters nor any longer able to finance either the UN systems or the big funds that were promised and pledged, that remain completely undercapitalized, like the adaptation fund. They all remain undercapitalized, and that brings us to a point that where do we get the scale of funds needed? It's only in the private sector, and to ask countries, developing countries with low technical capacity, to projectize and then gain the interest and attract the investments needed of the private sector is a mark's game. I'm sorry, it does not work. The private sector has not rushed and will not rush and should not be expected to rush to the front lines of climate distress. It will do so on the margin, it will do so for its CSR and ESGs, but it will not be able or be held accountable to do more. Now, what we see in terms of the quantum of money needed, in itself is a system. We see it as a systemic barrier, and it becomes a barrier ultimately to the building of trust also needed at the multilateral big tent level. The creation of a loss and damage fund was a big admission. It was what I call an investment in our collective futures, but it was a down payment that has yet to materialize. The reality staring us all in the face is now quite a glaring neon sign. Too many are being left behind. One of the big slogans of change, and you'll see it more and more at COP28, is leave no one behind. The reality is the emissions are tripling by 2050. That's the trajectory they're at. They're tripling, and many more large swathes of the developing world are being left behind to create new dystopias of climate distress and recovery loops that are very hard to break. Now, how do you square this with relatively small flows of capital, donor recoil, civil society watchdogging, and the state of the IFIs is a question that needs some plain speaking, and I hope you'll be addressing that. Now, my first point quickly for some of the issues you want to raise, and those are very important ones. Once again, public financing is not meeting even a fraction of the needs of climate adaptation or mitigation in the ballpark amounts required, nor is it able to manage climate distress in the time needed by countries and hotspots experiencing the accelerated impacts of climate change, because that's all changed. It is not on the 2050 Paris trajectory. We are shooting past that. So maximizing the effectiveness of climate finance must include, and its impacts must include, steps to reduce the potential naturally for corruption, because that will address donor recoil or investment recoil. As large influxes of resources coupled with an imperative to spend can create conditions ripe for corruption, we know that. So how do you address that? Well, transparency in auditing developments is not a new thing. We've all seen it both at the public and private levels, but it needs to be part of technical capacity enhancement packages that can and should be created for recipients of climate finance. From a donor's point of view, audits are embedded in lending and financial protocols, nothing new. But clearly, the opacity becomes a challenge in implementation and blocks further investment. In fact, even scares investment. So that's not a virtuous circle we're in. I mean, just according to Transparency International, there has been some success with anti-corruption controls around overseas development assistance just for the public sector. However, vast sums of climate finance are routed outside typical well-controlled channels because climate finance is governed now by a relatively new and complex network of institutions at the international, national, and local levels. Frameworks don't even gel with each other. Public financing is still in a definitional black hole. What do I mean by that? I mean that public financing finds itself on the ground in a grim carnival of double counting issues when countries are being made pledges to or are pledged finances to. Because that usually leaves us with a sputtering pipeline of climate financing, public sector, white elephant projects that don't near completion because the money runs out, because it was planned for one project or a part of budgetary support, but ends up doubling as ODA, whereas it was pledged as climate finance separately. So it creates layers of mistrust and confusion around planning and spending for resilience in developing countries. So that's something that has not been addressed at the public level, the definition of climate finance. If it can't be addressed, we will keep on seeing this loophole that we keep going back to. If it can't be addressed, which I was told at the Berlin conference is difficult to do, well, we will have to find a way around it, but it's my job to put it on the table because double counting has become a very serious issue and a site of mistrust for bilateral and MDB lending. So the other thing is that using multi-stakeholder accountability mechanisms can improve transparency and accountability in the design, implementation, and monitoring of adaptation and mitigation frameworks that can, be a path to unblocking the opaque door that we all want to open up. We also know that B2G or G2G financing can be guardrailed against graft by the partner or both the partners signing off for effectively utilizing the confidence building needed in the financing. Now, here's how you do it. An example of MDB and government financing meeting confidence building guarantees is the assurance of third-party audits, for instance, by the recipient country or entity, such as the government of Pakistan did in its Geneva Resilience Support Conference, where over $9 billion were pledged to rebuild one-third of the country that was inundated by the 2022 super flood. But confidence was shown in the statement that we will allow all third-party audits and, in fact, will enable it. So I think that was one of the items or issues that attracted. It was it attracted investment and it attracted pledges by donors. Now, private investment flows can also often be seen as predatory in terms of interest rates or capital flowing back or indebtedness, raising debt back to source. One of the ways is it's not transparent due to two-way bargains that lead to low transparency or rise from low transparency. How many cents to the dollar goes back to the donor? We've all seen and heard about that. Even for public financing, the money that disappears has run into notorious figures. I mean, many examples from the development world abound, particularly over 20 years in Afghanistan. But even across the world, how do you enhance auditing regimes without creating mission bloat and an MRV architecture that takes on a life of its own, becoming either prohibitive or too onerous for recipients to manage? So the way around it would be really to build into projects separate technical capacity building and transfer of that capacity to the offices and ministries and countries that are managing especially large consortiums for investment, and so that they don't become white elephants and sit around, and nor do they get leached by non-transparency and audit opacity. So I think it works out best for everybody. But also, I've noted, as in my 1 year in public service, again after a long time in climate for one thing, that a lot of the capacity being transferred, human capacity is the most needed. And very often we keep getting told, it's deeply frustrating, that no, you have X amount of people in your office, ma'am. All right, I'm not such a huge ministry that I have to use a golf cart to run across to an office and see that these are actually ghost technical workers. So very often we have technical capacity that is not really there. And it is by some of our best development partners. I'm not here to name and shame, because without them we really have very little to go on. So I'm grateful for that too, that they're there and they're able to build for us some level of capacity, even when it comes to risk assessment and needs management. Finally, I want to say that the global climate crisis has left no country untouched, but it is the developing world that is facing the most severe and unaccounted for consequences. So in this context, IFIs, including the World Bank, particularly the World Bank and ADB, are the most flexible. But other multilateral development banks and the International Monetary Fund have a critical role to play in supporting climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts worldwide. While they have been crucial players in providing technical support, loan-based support, project financing, and they're the most agile, especially the World Bank and ADB on the ground when ready assistance is needed, particularly human assistance, human resource, and human capital. They still have to readapt their instruments and broaden their initiatives to allow and leverage grant-based financing. We are now all almost receiving only loans. But I mean, they are concessional, true, but everything is piling on the public debt, leading to a crisis in public financing. Now, which obviously the country has to account for other reasons as well. But climate stress is now adding on 9% of a haircut on our GDP every year. Just regular climate change, which includes glacial melt. And because we have the largest amount of glaciers outside the polar region, and obviously a heat wave event such as 53.7 degrees, such as last year and the year before that, trigger a cascade of then extreme weather, which the country is not prepared for. The resources needed to limit the reversal of development gains, mitigate the additional risks associated with recent exogenous shocks and global crises, the weakening of the resilience of populations to climate change, in which women and children are the most vulnerable. They're on the front line of all shocks, are estimated at $4.2 trillion. Now, who's going to promote the access to funding of adequate size with terms that are not suffocating for the beneficiaries? I leave you to discuss, and I hope a great deal comes out of this. In the end, and lastly, the functioning of these institutions needs to change to handle the most extensive mobilization of international finance in history to help developing nations adapt to and cope with a very speedily warming planet. Leaders in the global south are calling for the restructuring of global financial institutions to enable climate financing, since they were designed, as you know, they were only designed for the 20th century and not for the post-climate change era of today. So developing countries are borrowing at much higher rates than developed countries, creating a heavier debt burden that becomes a significant drain on national budgets, which we are in the middle of right now. In fact, lower income countries are spending 5 times more on debt servicing than on climate mitigation and adaptation, according to many reports. So a fair amount of thought leadership and retooling is needed, both for markets and public institutions, to change their instruments to meet growing needs. Navigating a forest of barriers has become normalized for accessing green financing. This has to change. If enhanced transparency and audits can incentivize change and trigger investments on the ground, we would all benefit from this exercise in real time. Thank you for your patience, and I'm sorry I can't stay with you. I have several balls up in the air right now.
Well, thank you so much for making the time to join us and for outlining some of the challenges that we all face together. and some of your concerns about the role of MFIs, although I was happy to hear you called the World Bank to be efficient and quick on the ground. I think I'm going to have to make sure that message gets back to our new president. Thank you very much. And we look forward to addressing some of the points that you've raised, particularly around the need for transparency and greater accountability and inclusion in this link to poverty that you were highlighting. Let me now turn to Remy. It's a real pleasure to hear from you and to get the perspective of AFD. Over to you, Remy.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to Creon and Chatham House it's a great honor to be invited introducing this discussion. As always, Chatham House discussions are timely and topical. So it's really excited to hear from you, and thanks to you, Ali and dear Louise, also. And we remember when you were in our office to discuss this idea of the GPSA, and we're extremely proud to be part of this new initiative, and extremely excited as well with President Bonga coming. I heard him yesterday, if I'm right, interviewed by Farid Zakaria before going to the Caribbean, if I'm right, and Paris soon. And so the first days of his mandate, with the vibrant, very active discussion that is taking place, are extremely promising, and we certainly turn to the bank for guidance and for support and for bringing in an inclusive way the whole ecosystem, and provide also the knowledge, because we are at a stage where we need Chatham House and we need the discussions to make the mandates of public development banks and more broadly clearer than it was since 2015. So probably you invited me because I was the chief negotiator on finance back in 2015 during COP21 for the French presidency with Minister Fabius and Laurence Tubiana. Maybe because I had AFD since 2015. We originated 7 billion euro climate finance last year, 30% for adaptation. Maybe because I chair this IDFC club group of 26 national and regional public development banks that originated 224 billion US dollar climate finance. Last figures is 2021, with the China Development Bank, DBSA, BNDES, KfW, many strong financial institutions turning to SDGs and Paris. Maybe because we are pushing this Finance in Common forum initiative to gather us all, the 550 public development banks in the world, 2.5 trillion investments, not enough climate within, but to have the discussion and to incentivize all these institutions in the best possible direction. So this is my duties, but if you allow me, Creon, and because this is Chatham House, I will maybe share more personal comments without the commitment of all these fora, just to reflect on the discussions you will have today, and because I feel time has come to surpass maybe tensions, and we heard from the minister that there are a lot of tensions rising, that there's a lot of distrust growing between so-called I hate these categories, global north, global south. We know that since 2015 there's a strong and understandable resistance between development and climate. We know that probably the question of governance is not sufficiently factored in the fight against climate change. So time has come, and we know, and sorry, I will have to leave you also and not stay for the whole session, but you know, we have next week a summit in Paris about a new global financing pact that President Macron invited in Sharm el-Sheikh during COP27, because he felt at that time that we were somehow at a standstill, and that we need a place, we need a discussion between leaders on climate and sustainable finance, and a highly political discussion. Not that this summit next week is necessarily the place where the decisions will be taken. There are legitimate, more legitimate places for that. The G20 in India very soon. Of course, the IMF and World Bank Marrakesh meetings that will be so important on African soil, and also COP28 in Dubai in December. But we thought that it was helpful, and it seems that it has traction, because when I see the number and the quality of participants next week in Paris, we are really eager to listen to all of them, from China, from the US, from Africa, from Brazil, from Europe, not by themselves, of course, with public and private actors in the room. And we hope that it will pave the way for, yes, Minister, more ambition, more consensus, more international cooperation to face common challenges. And it will happen in Paris. And maybe you will see that there's an ecosystem in Paris, of course, not exclusively. I mean, there are discussions happening in Washington, in London, in Rome, in Songdo, in Nairobi, of course, everywhere. But we have a young generation, especially on the research side, especially on political science, political economy, that is now more and more paying attention to the consequences of climate for politics and finance and economy, and they are providing their input in this discussion. And we have to answer at the same time, because otherwise they will stay in the streets, and the tensions will become also, well, they're already there. They will become highly political in each and every democracy in the world. So we hope that next week will be a step in the right direction. And we hope, I come back to AFD, and maybe Louise and Ali to the World Bank, help us having the most consistent, ambitious, coherent mandate, and that our leaders will ease the tensions. We are sensors. We are actors, but we are also incredible sensors of what is happening between sectors, between regions, between various actors, and we want to share that experience with them. To have the most effective and in-depth discussion. 3 points on my side to introduce. The first one is, of course, to agree with you that climate finance is transforming classic ODA. And for a time, I mean, since 2015 up to now, probably it was very helpful. And we saw, maybe there's a bit of double counting, of course, but the good news is that climate finance increased and ODA increased at the same time. So there was a twin benefit since Paris and New York back in 2015 and Addis Abeba, to have a narrative combining, I would say, poverty and nature and climate. My personal feeling, is that this is reversing, and this is becoming detrimental now, and creating yes, distrust and lack of clarity. And so we need. We published a few months ago a small paper that is called ODA at the Edge of Consequences. We need help for that, to have another framework emerging, surpassing the divide between development and climate, probably to redefine two other public policies. One, and the World Bank is structured like that, so it's not that far. A public policy for the most vulnerable, where we should allocate, maximum concessional resources, of course, to finance what nobody's financing. So this is the purpose of IDA for forever, and set more clearly this guarantee that the most vulnerable countries, I'm not saying the poorest, I'm saying the most vulnerable, of course, including vulnerability into poverty assessment, so that they are reassured that they will never have less than that threshold, that guarantee on one side. But if we do that, so we could add the humanitarian, we could add part of ODA, significant part of ODA. We could add adaptation, probably investments. We will have to increase and insert loss and damage in this pot on one side, so that we can unlock the second mandate, which is for now, in my view, totally unclear, which is the mandate, I would say, of sustainable investment for mitigation. I would say, to put it bluntly, it's bigger than that. Of course, we have to do it in each and every country where we can reduce emissions. And of course, we have to mobilize private finance and public investments like never. And so we need this twin mandate. So the discussion is happening right now at the level of the World Bank. That's one of the reasons we are turning to you, Louise, and to President Bonga, because if clarity comes from this discussion, it will reverberate in the whole financial system. Private, of course, because we will mobilize more private finance, and this is when and only this way we can be at scale, but also on the public side, and for all public development banks, starting with other MDBs, of course, but way beyond, including international agencies like mine, but also national financial institutions. So there's a lot of work here. We need a clarity at the political level, and then there's a lot of work, of course, at the technical level following this clarity. I'm a bit anxious and afraid now to see. Yes, the fragmentation in terms of accountability. We have ODA. ODA. I respect, I value ODA. It's the most structured, transparent, clear mode of accountability. It's probably the only global policy existing around. $200 billion US. We know where they're coming from. We know where they're going. We know the weaknesses as well. But it's really a set of principles that we discussed, that we defined since 1969. Of course, climate finance is different. Climate finance is distinct. Climate finance is developing its own accountability with the UNFCCC principles, with TCFD, with now TNFD, with, of course, public being part of the discussion on sustainable finance, the EU taxonomies, IDFC and World Bank and MDB's principles. So there's another set of, another referential that is coming, that is emerging. I really hope we will not compose the two of them and somehow bring the best of the two worlds, meaning the seriousness and the transparency of ODA, with, of course, the DAC and all those that created that framework for so long, decades, and the ambition of climate and the mobilization of private finance factor that is only ingrained in climate finance. This was the big novelty of Copenhagen and Cancun. And so we need between, it's not for leaders here, we need between technicians to define the consolidated framework between development and finance. And I think it's not that far, but a lot of goodwill is expected to go in that direction. So that's my first point. Second point is somehow governance has been missing in these discussions, probably because climate was more an issue for scientists first, and then an issue for financiers that were summoned, of course, to come in this discussion and to discuss with science, which is not easy. We need to provide expertise in the field of governance in the discussion about climate. And this is also where, of course, the World Bank, this is also where agencies, other public banks, NGOs, think tanks, we have a lot to share. So at AFD, for instance, we aligned with Paris back in 2017. So we did our homework, I think, to be accountable and demonstrate that we are doing nothing that is contrary to the country's trajectories, NDCs and long-term trajectories. And we verify with an internal procedure that all banks could somehow adopt or adapt to their needs, that every euro or dollar we mobilize on the markets is aligned with Paris. We are now in the next step, which is to align with SDGs, because our experience is that social and economic is coming immediately after the focus on climate, and that's good news. And when I mean aligning with SDGs, it means also adding the governance and the political dimension attached to climate, social, and economic. So when in the new strategy we are elaborating right now, we need to put governance questions higher in our understanding of what it means to be aligned with SDGs. And of course, we rely on all partners that are sometimes more experienced than AFD on this aspect to help us bring that consistency and maybe be a bit more stringent, a bit more active, a bit more attentive to this, of course, to do it from the perspective of a development bank, of a development agency, which is probably a bit different from advocacy or discussions between government on the political economy of climate. And of course, what we want to push is, I would say, how rights are born. How could we, from development projects and programs, help countries, communities progress in human and environmental rights? So we are not lecturing, of course, as development agencies, and it's my last point. I'll be short. It's up to the countries in the end to set their climate and political democratic trajectories. But I think public banks can be extremely helpful, well, in demonstrating that this is possible. and that if you recognize rights in the implementation of development projects, well, the impact is higher. I mean, the results are better. And so, and if we have this common understanding with our counterparts and with our clients and partners and countries, I mean, why not, in the end, change the law? Why not change the regulation if we have demonstrated, if we have provided evidence that the results are better? We did that for gender or for many aspects on the government side. Why not on climate? And then, of course, bring to this discussion our specific expertise, bridging world experiences, including our in France or elsewhere about green budgeting, green bonds, well, long-term planning. I mean, all the technology that is needed to face the challenge of climate change. I close by saying, and maybe as a way to answer the minister's intervention before me, that we certainly, as public banks, know and feel that the solution will only come from the countries themselves and not from abroad. And we need international investment, international solidarity like never. But the country ownership, the country buy-in, the mobilization of local actors, the right public policies, the right governance, you will discuss it, are preconditions to the success in fighting for global commons. So that's something certainly development actors can also bring because of their decades of experience on what works or not to the climate discussion. And I want to come back here to the role of national development banks and the role of this finance in common initiative. I'm with so much passion pushing. I don't think the solution only rests in IFIs, and I put AFD as part of the IFIs world. So if you could somehow enlarge your session 3 and the conclusions of this Chatham House discussion, and please pay attention to all our fellow CEOs and colleagues in national and subnational and regional and financial institutions, public financial institutions. I mean, they merit that. They are not sufficiently factored in this discussion. The bulk of the financing is there. They are one of our key allies in their constituency, because I've never met a CEO of a public bank for the last 7 years. I'm at the head of AFD. I do not agree with. I mean, because they see climate and the tragedy of climate change mounting in each and every project they are accompanying. And they are searching for the technologies. They are searching for the solution. They are craving for more attention and leveraging of their own capacities and balance sheet. They're not perfect, of course, but who is? and they want to be part of a very large global infrastructure of public investment. Again, it's 2.5 trillion US dollar existing investments this year. So it's not a promise. And the question is, are these 2.5 trillion green or not? Are they just or not? And so I think it's key to demonstrate that we are at scale. And also, if all these guys are mobilizing private finance, probably way better than what we are doing. And if they can play their part as platforms in their own country to reassure their government that this is possible, that we can be pragmatic on climate change and we can provide results. So please, the DBSAs of the world in the JET-P in South Africa, the PTSMI of the world in the JET-P in Indonesia, the BIDV in Vietnam, the BNDS in Brazil, the Caisse des dépôts et consignations here in France, because we have to do also the transition here in a country that is so severely exposed to high temperature and coastal erosion here in France. We are beginning to understand that, and we need public financial capacities to do that. Of course, and I close on this, in a multilateral framework. And this is where I come back to the World Bank. If we do that in a fragmented way, if we do that without the proper guidance, if we do that without the best possible technologies transferred and the results of the research, we will lose a lot of time. But it has started, actually. And this is what we phrased in Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. This is what was the message. The transformation will happen at countries level. And we need local actors to do that in a global and international framework that is recognized by our leaders. So it's part international investments, of course, but it's also, Minister, part of domestic resource mobilization. And it's not only financial. I mean, in the end, it's highly political, but public banks, I'm sure, can play an interesting role in this discussion.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Remy, thank you so much. That's, you set out a big challenge, both of you, highlighting the fact that we need much more ODA. Both Remy and the minister highlighted the fact that ODA is needed and is not enough. Slightly different points of view on the role of the private sector. I think the minister was a little less upbeat on the ability of the private sector to deliver on the ESG agenda, and I think Remy was a bit more recognizing that importance. And bringing in also the role, which is interesting, I've not heard too much of national development banks and how they can contribute to climate finance. But in the end, the clear point of agreement, and I think the launching point for the next part of our discussions here in the room, is about this governance, this need for more governance and a recognition that more is needed. And you also called on the multilateral banks, and in particular the World Bank, for frameworks and knowledge about how to make this aid better, and the quality side that Ali and I were both, and Kriyan were emphasizing. So I think this is a huge agenda because it's new and it's just starting. And I think our plea to you, Remy, is as you go forward in your discussions, we will try to feed from today some insight on how to strengthen the governance side and how to build these frameworks to make the ODA more effective, to enhance the private sector's engagement. But please help us take this to the center stage, because this has not been sufficiently developed and sufficiently highlighted as something that can drive more and especially better climate finance. So with that, huge thanks for joining. Good luck next week, and thank you for the session. Well, I think we close it.
Thank you, Ali, thank you. Remy, thank you, and also thanks to the Minister. That's a really great opening session, so if we could thank our speakers. That would be... So we're going to move straight on into the next